Merci à tous d'être présents aujourd'hui. L'événement je vais présenter peut-être en premier. Mon nom est Chantal Robillard, je suis coordonnatrice de recherche clinique pour le CIUS Centre-Ouest. Je suis aussi professeure associée au département de sexologie à l'UQAM et responsable du regroupement stratégique TIC et santé, TIC pour technologie de l'information, de la communication et santé pour le réseau de recherche en santé des populations du Québec. Donc aujourd'hui, l'événement est un peu différent pour ceux qui sont membres du réseau, un peu différent des activités CRIR, dans le sens où c'est une collaboration entre TIC et santé et le CRIR. Et donc, la présentation sera un petit peu plus longue qu'une heure. On termine à 1h30. La visioconférence ne coupera pas donc à 1h, donc vous pouvez rester un petit peu plus longtemps. Aujourd'hui, donc, on a invité Sara Ahmed et Aiki Thomas, toutes deux professeurs à l'école de physio et ergo de l'Université McGill. Elles vont présenter sur l'utilisation des TIC par les chercheurs dans le processus de transfert de connaissances en donnant l'exemple de Brillant. Sarah et Aiki, est-ce que vous voulez prendre un petit 2 minutes pour vous présenter peut-être?
Oui. Oui. Merci beaucoup, Chantal. Alors, comme Chantal vient de dire, je suis professeure à l'Université de McGill en ergo et physiothérapie. Je suis chercheuse ici au CRIR et je gère un programme de recherche sur la gestion des maladies chroniques et l'utilisation des systèmes informatisés dans les services de santé.
OK, donc moi, c'est Aiki Thomas. Je suis aussi à l'école de physiothérapie et ergothérapie de l'Université McGill. Je suis ergothérapeute de formation. Ma programmation de recherche est axée principalement sur le transfert des connaissances et les sciences de l'implantation, méthodes, modèles pour soutenir le transfert des connaissances. Et puis, c'est ça, c'est plus principalement dans le contexte de l'AVC.
Alors, la présentation se fera en anglais, mais n'hésitez pas à vous exprimer dans la langue de votre choix, anglais ou français, idéalement. Apparemment, il y a du grec aussi, si c'est possible. Je ne sais pas d'autres langues. Et les questions, on va les garder pour la fin pour vraiment avoir un temps d'échange et de discussion. Donc, je vous laisse.
Merci, Chantal. So thank you very much for the invitation to present and for joining us this afternoon. So like Chantal mentioned, what we'll share with you is some of the thinking we've been doing around the use of technology to support knowledge translation. And some of you have heard about the project Brillant before, so we might share the same information again. Hopefully it'll help stimulate even more ideas and more thinking around the project. But this time, today, given that the focus is on knowledge translation, what I'll try to do during the time that I'm talking is to really bring out the aspects of what are we trying to do as a network of Brillant and how knowledge translation is really important for us to succeed in meeting our objectives. And then turn it over to Aiki, who will share with us the science around KT and around implementation science and how structuring and using some standardized methodology can help us ensure that we meet our objectives in Brillant. And so Brillant is an initiative that really stemmed out of looking to see what are some of the needs of the clinical sites that we're working with and patients, and how can technology start to address some of those needs. Just to give you some logistical background about Brillant, or I guess more administrative aspects of it. Essentially, in 2017, we received the great news that the Canadian Foundation of Innovation, along with other partners, including the ministry and our universities and our sites that we're working with, have provided funding for us to put in place the technologies that could help support the objectives of Brillant. At the time, we're 10 core researchers spanning different areas of expertise, from health services, health information, technology, biomedical research, that came together and said, how could we bring our fields together to address the objectives of Brillant? Our core founding partners of the Brillant are these three CIUSs and CISs, who also contribute extensively through the involvement of the clinicians and patients within these health regions, but also through understanding existing innovations in these sites and helping us move forward with Brillant. So what inspired Brillant is our understanding of what the needs of individuals with disabilities are in the population. And specifically, Brillant will target individuals with acquired brain injury, and I'll talk a little bit more about why we chose that population. But these statistics also help to see where there's a need in terms of the fact that 60% of individuals return back to the community still having limitations in mobility. 50 to 75% continue to report limitations in participation and social isolation. In addition to the high prevalence of the number of individuals that with acquired brain injury, we know that there's a huge economic cost associated with trying to put in place the services and in both indirect and direct costs. And there's also that other aspect of need of getting evidence into practice. So when we look at the numbers of how easy is it to use evidence in informing everyday clinical decision making, we see that from some of our national surveys that 74%, for example, of physiotherapists have reported going to the literature to help support decision making around 5 times per month. Among OTs as well, 38% reported using research findings to inform their practices. And it's not out of a lack of value or importance of this evidence, it's just a matter of feasibility. And so part of what Brillant will look at is where are there some areas that we could facilitate the use of evidence in practice. Since we found out, from developing the application for the CFI and since finding out, we've been meeting with our different partners to understand what some of the needs are. This actually comes from Nancy, some of the work you presented, where one of the patient partners said ideally we would have a continuum where there are no noticeable jumps. As soon as I read that, I'm like, oh, patient portal, and I'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit about how that links to Brillant. But other needs that have come up, the need to access measures and to be able to evaluate how clients are doing not only during rehabilitation but once they leave. That it would be great to be able to go back and say, among all patient clients who came to our center, what types of interventions did they get? Did we consistently give certain interventions to certain subgroups of individuals? Which ones worked? The need as well to have common definition of what is accessibility. So when we think about mobility in the community, which is a focus of Brillant, how do we define accessibility and good versus poor mobility? And then the other aspect of, and this we hear very often, is that once our clients leave, we don't know how they're doing. We don't know if the interventions we gave during care actually had long-term impacts or if there's something else we should have modified while patients were here. So these are the kinds of conversations that are extremely valuable for us to figure out how do we shape the technologies in Brillant to meet these needs. So already from what I've said, I'm hoping that you're starting to get a sense of the importance of knowledge translation. So this is the knowledge to action cycle that is sort of a pillar of KT research and work, which talks about, and I'll briefly talk about it, but I know Aiki's going to get into a lot more of the terminology and the meaning of these different boxes. But it pretty much splits up knowledge translation in 2 big areas. One is the generation of new knowledge. So where are there areas where we don't know what the evidence is? As well, and then the second aspect is the action aspect of it, where we do have evidence, but how do we put it in place into patient care? And so Brillant is really ideally, and you'll see from my discussion about the use of data, will contribute to knowledge generation, the generation of new knowledge that comes from the work with our clinicians, with our patients and families, as well as the research component of it, but also the taking what already exists in terms of evidence and working with our teams to put that into practice. We know we have several unanswered questions around mobility and rehabilitation. The key is to work together among different stakeholder groups to co-construct these questions and then decide what data should we use. So this is really important, that rather than saying we want data and we go collect everything, it's what are the key data elements that we really need? What are those pieces that really help us answer the questions we have? Because the opposite end of not having enough information is having too much information. And then the next thing is then when we have these questions, how could we set up our health system in terms of technologies, in terms of culture, in terms of process that will help us answer those questions very rapidly. So specifically, the objectives of the Brillant project is to evaluate those factors that limit or facilitate mobility in the community. So we are thinking about mobility not only during the period of rehabilitation when clients are with us as inpatients, but also once they return home, in their homes, in their workspaces, in malls. So some of you might have been involved in one way or another in the Rehab Career Mall project. So again, Brillant was really inspired by the work that was done there. So we want to be able to figure out what are those factors, how can we measure those factors and start to understand their interrelationships. And as you might be getting a sense of already, when we talk about mobility, we're not just talking about the physical aspects of it, but we're really talking about the whole person in their environment. And so we've often turned to the Weber framework for mobility to help us realize the complexity of mobility and that it's not a simple thing as just figuring out the impairments, activity limitations, and participation, but it's really thinking about the person and their interaction with the environment, whether it's their home or the larger public. And then, of course, it could be influenced by many of these other factors that are on the right side, which are the determinants that we know influence why some people do better than others. It has to do with finance, it has to do with psychosocial, with their supports that they have from family and friends, etc. So these are the other aspects that we can't ignore if we truly want to address the needs of patients once they return home. The second objective of Brillant is then to take that data and answer questions that are generated from the clinical milieu, but also to figure out what are those interventions and services that are going to help individuals do better over the long term. So doing this comparative effectiveness research between different types of intervention. And we understand that the generation of evidence today is much more than just randomized controlled trials. Absolutely, randomized trials are really key in terms of they generate one of the highest levels of evidence right before systematic reviews. But we also understand that there's a rich amount of information that can be taken from everyday patient care. If we could capture just what's happening in everyday patient care and understand that, the amount of evidence we can generate just from comparing, patient A and B who have very similar profiles but maybe got slightly different intensities of intervention or different types of intervention, that is also rich information that can generate evidence and generate it much faster, less costly than trying to run randomized trials where we often have to wait 4 or 5 years to get an answer to the question. And so this is sort of our thinking about how do we set up the Brillant technology. The other question is, you have the technology, you have the data, you know what your questions are, but then how do you get that information of the hands of clinicians and patients to support decision making in a timely way? And understanding that getting that information, the information has to be relevant, so it has to be answering the right questions, and it has to be tailored. Clinicians and patients need to recognize the value of that and be able to say, yes, in my context, it really will be helpful to have this information so that it actually can make its way into clinical decision making. So to do that, 2 important pieces of technology that we'd like to develop through Brillant are the patient portal. And these technologies help to both capture information but also to send back information. So for the patient portal, we know that what we'll be able to do more than ever is to capture patient-reported outcome measures and patient-reported experience measures, so that we're also using outcomes that are meaningful to patients, that resonates with clients in terms of asking about their physical, their mental, their social health, which they feel is impacted by their condition from day to day. To also be able to do what we call ecological evaluations. So evaluation is useful only to the extent in which it's relevant in a given context. So for somebody who's going, into a mall, for example, and experiences a barrier, it's very different for them to be able to report that on their phone, for example, or on a tablet or some device that they might have, at that point in time, rather than wait to ask them a month later when they might or might not remember what they can explain, in their environment is very different. So how could we better, and we often use our phones, like how many of us check our phones, like I think I've checked it 50 times just this morning. So it's not unexpected that we might, if it's easy enough, click and report about something we've experienced that's impeding our ability to function or move around in the environment. In terms of monitoring, yes, we want the client to report, but we also don't want to make it burdensome. So we're also working with our biomedical colleagues to say, how can some of the more complex technologies that they use in a lab environment be lighter so that it can go into the public environment and we be able to sort of passively collect this data in terms of people's mobility, how they're interacting with the environment, what are they looking at, what are they what is the lighting in that environment. Devices are even able to capture motions now based on facial recognition. So there are endless possibilities, but the question is which are the right ones that are most feasible and most useful in terms of the information they can provide. The other part that the patient portal can help with, so I talked about getting information, but also giving back information. So how could clients, for the 99.9% of the time that they're not in contact with a health professional or in the walls of our clinical sites, receive information that's meaningful to help them better manage their condition? For clinicians, it's the same thing. It's being able to put in an electronic format what you already collect from day to day in terms of performance-based measures, what interventions are you delivering to clients. This is a big one, which is the ability to share information between interdisciplinary team members and communicate more readily through having an electronic system. And then, of course, for clinicians to also receive evidence-based recommendations that would be a combination of based on information collected from clients, combined from information from the clinical system that clinicians provide, combined maybe with the monitoring data that's been captured through some of the technological devices. So how can all of that be integrated to provide evidence-based recommendations, again, that with relevant information that's tailored to the client that's in front of them at that time? So I chose to pull out two technologies in Brillant for our discussion of knowledge translation today, because those are really the key that will help us connect with clinicians and connect with patients in terms of having them generate new knowledge and having us be able to push back evidence-based practices that's based on integrated information. So these are the two boxes that you see here, the patient portal, the clinician system, recognizing that for everything I just described, this whole data exchange, access to the data, there's a whole ecological system of other technologies that have to be put in place. We don't see them necessarily as end users, as a clinician or a researcher or a client. But for it to actually work and be sustainable, there has to be an infrastructure around these portable mobility technologies. I didn't talk about brain imaging, but we also have colleagues that are working on understanding recovery of the brain by doing MRIs and looking at blood flow and high resolution. That's another piece of data that will be useful that currently we can't make use of in clinical practice because it's just too separate from what we do in everyday clinical care. But if we can combine it with other data that I just talked about, whether it's patient-reported outcomes, whether it's performance-based measures that clinicians provide, then we could have this rich database, and the database can then be used to do what we call predictive analytics, but it's essentially answering that first objective of Brillant, which is what are the factors that influence mobility and what is the interplay of those factors. I don't have a mouse, but I am moving around to try to point to the green box bottom left, activity 1.4. And then take that information, create decision support algorithms. I can introduce a whole bunch of other fancy words like artificial intelligence and natural learning processing, but in that box where you see rays, these are the kind of expertise that we also need to be happening in the back end to make use of this huge amount of data. And then feeding it back to the top right blue box, which is what are the interventions. All of that gets crystallized to say what do you do when, for which client that is most likely going to improve mobility and participation in the future. So there's this whole, again, ecological infrastructure of technologies in the back end that needs to be supported. So just, I've talked about collaboration between clinicians, between patients, families, between researchers. Already there's a huge amount of knowledge translation, engagement, integrated KT that Aiki will do, will talk to us more about in the second half of this talk. But for that ecological infrastructure to be created, put in place, and then work and be sustained over the long term takes a huge number of players. We're fortunate to have our clinical sites who agreed, without us knowing where we're going to end up, work with us to start thinking about this and start engaging and asking the questions and saying, how do we create these technologies? And within there, in the middle, you see all of our stakeholders that are involved, from clinicians, decision makers, patients. Our CRCs are going to play a key role because they bridge between all the research we do and the clinical programs, administrators, the researchers in each of these centers. But around that also are other partners that we need to pay attention to and engage very early on in our integrated KT process. I'll give some examples, which are the CEFRIO, which is the ministry arm of that looks at technologies in the province. So whatever we create has to be in line with the greater provincial vision of how technologies are going to be integrated into healthcare. In each of these sites, I think when we went through the exercise, we found that there are 7 different directorships that will have to be involved in each of these sites. So whether it's research, health information technology, quality improvement, data information systems, 7 groups with 7 directors with 7 teams under them that we need to make sure understand why we're doing this, that believe in what we're doing and see the value in supporting it. So a huge number of players. And so to help us structure this and help us ensure that we hear all the voices of everybody involved in our group, among our stakeholder groups, is to have a governance structure. So one of the first things that we spent a lot of time doing, and we don't expect this to stay exactly the same, as we learn it might evolve, is to put in place a governance structure that brings in outside people to provide input on what we're doing, and is it in line with sort of international visions of what we should be doing for acquired brain injury and technology. Our research committee, which is ourselves, but everybody across the career and outside the career, a clinical advisory group, health service users, so patient and family groups, and then other committees that trickle down into our sites and are on the ground in each of our sites and each of our CISs and CUSs that help with the implementation and management of this. So there's a huge number of people and work and effort that's represented in each of these boxes. And you can imagine the importance of communication to make sure that everybody remains engaged, that everybody's voice is heard and balanced in what we decide to do. And I think if we just went around the room now and asked everybody to write down how they define mobility, we'd probably come out with 5 or 10 themes that we can classify mobility under. And so the ability to use a common language that resonates with each of the stakeholder groups that I mentioned is also really important. And as I'm learning from the great students in my lab, is that there's a whole science around that called ontology development. And so we're just working on standardizing the way that sort of the dictionary of mobility and all of those factors I showed you in the Weber model. So just to say that there's a lot of work being done just to make sure we speak a common language. Just to show you what the complexity of that common language is, we're just mapping out the words. Mobility from a physical, psychosocial, and then we need to figure out the interrelationships between them. But the key, it's really important that we go through this step and eventually we'll look at these complex maps with clinical and patient partners, obviously not in this format. Aiki is going to help us put it in a format that resonates from a KT perspective. But to say, because we need it to be guided by, thinking about what is mobility, what are the important concepts, how should we start thinking about their interrelationships from a conceptual perspective based on knowledge and expertise of everybody who's been working with acquired brain injury, rather than let the numbers and the analysis tell us. So it's just good practice to make sure we use the right words, we think about these relationships before we put it into an analysis and have it spit out a conclusion for us. And so the way that, and I'm almost done, I have got a couple of more slides, but the way that I would summarize this is essentially what we're trying to put in place is a technological infrastructure that, if we do our jobs well, will on its own allow us to create a learning healthcare system where there are all the different pieces that we learn from the everyday encounters with patients. If the technology does what it's supposed to do, be as little of a disruption, it's always going to be a disruption in the beginning, but over time be less of a disruption, where data is naturally making its way into a centralized database that we can pull out that data and learn from it, then we'll have achieved what we call as a système de santé prenant, which is the intersection of technology, culture, science to learn from everyday clinical care. In summary, what Brillant wants to do is to improve services of care based on evidence-based practices, to empower patients and families so that they also get the right information and care that they need to be able to manage their health, like I said, for the time that they're not necessarily in contact with a health professional, and to be able to continue to innovate and develop better interventions for clients. To do that, we'll co-construct strategies to synthesize and diffuse information that we learn through Brillant and through existing evidence, empower patients through sharing with them some of these tools as well, but also to help improve among clinicians knowledge, confidence for managing patients, and for us to provide clinical programs with the tools that they feel they need for patient care. I'm just going to use the word open science. Has anybody heard this term in the room? Okay, so it's this idea that when we create any scientific output, that it belongs to the public. It shouldn't belong to one group or one institution. And so we are looking at concepts of open science, which in itself is a knowledge translation process because it's participatory. It's going to the public to ask, here's a project called Brillant, here is what we want to do, what do you think? And it usually takes a whole other direction than well, not whole other, but it brings in elements that perhaps we would not have thought about. And it brings in patient groups that say, well, for our membership, we always want, for example, a database of accessible places for sports or whatever it might be, that we have the infrastructure, we have the bandwidth to collect through Brillant, but we might not have thought of otherwise. But also then to say, how do we set it up so that other people can use the technologies, can use the data that we create, so it doesn't sit in one place and not necessarily get used by the broader good, where we risk the work being replicated or not maximizing the value of what we're doing. I'm going to end my last 30 seconds by talking about the evolving role as a researcher, because we all evolve in our professions, I think, in what we do, but in bringing researchers to be sort of ambassadors, I guess, of knowledge translation and all the work that they do, we're learning to be facilitators, which we're very good at doing maybe in small groups. For myself, having to do that among 10 different groups and sometimes getting those groups to work together, it is a new skill. And some people spend careers just training how to be a facilitator. Building partnerships and understanding organizational change, that no, it's not going to happen tomorrow, and these are the 10 reasons why it's not going to happen tomorrow. I'm only listening to the first 10. Becoming really good at marketing and social media. So, we're encouraged now to go on Twitter, go on Facebook, go, in all the free time that we have. And then engagement, but the part about engagement, which is I find challenging, is how do you give an equal voice to all the different stakeholder parties? And, often I'll hear things like, you're the researcher, and can you answer these 10 questions? And I'm like, no, I can't answer them. Can you answer them? Because I don't have the answers. So it's sort of saying that everybody has an equal contribution to make. It might come from a different perspective or expertise, but how do you give that equal voice? And some of you might have experienced this if you've tried to bring in patient partners to be part of different discussion groups. It's really important how those sessions are structured so that they feel confident that they can speak and that they can contribute. So it's learning that skill. So this is sort of the skills that I always think, if I can go away for a 1-week retreat, I'll learn, I'd go to a retreat that can teach me these different things. So that's it for me. Et je pense on prend des questions à la fin. C'est ça. OK. Je vais passer la parole à Aiki.
Okay. So I could take questions in French, no problem later, but it's going to take me longer to do this in French than in English. But so I get the pleasure of doing. So Sarah get the pleasure of doing the really cool part of the presentation because it's about all the technology and the fun stuff. And I talk to you about theory, but I'm really going to try to make theory and some of the scientific aspects of KT a little more exciting. So I really do want to focus a little bit on the collaborative aspects and draw a little bit from the Brillant example. So this is not a surprise, right? So there's this huge spectrum between the discoveries that we make in science, right, and how they actually find themselves later on in the context of improving the health of humans, right? So what I'm doing today is not giving you all of that, but there's so many different activities between this, along this continuum, and Sarah started giving you some examples. So it's pretty clear that when we generate research. So this is the scientist at the left end. So we generate research, and then we sort of synthesize this research, and then we disseminate it. Right? These are typical activities of researchers. But doing this now is very, very clear. We have compelling evidence that this is insufficient to change knowledge and to change practice. Right? So these processes are important in the scientific endeavor, but in terms of changing practices, they're not as effective as we would like them to be. So essentially this idea that there's an underutilization of scientific evidence of different kinds, right? So this is the pyramid of the levels of evidence. Sarah talked about RCTs pretty much being at the top. This is research evidence. I'm going to talk to you about different forms of knowledge, which is the area that gets me very excited. And this idea that, there's an underutilization of this research that can help us with making clinical decisions and, most importantly, improving patient care, and that it's often called the research practice gap. So this is probably an expression that you've heard before. And of course, the solution is KT, right? So knowledge translation is a field that is really rising. It's been about 25 years, but there's more and more activity, lots of exciting research being done. And the work that Brillant is doing is a really good exemplar of that. So one of the challenges is that there are many terms that are being used to refer to knowledge translation. But unfortunately, if anybody has ever thought of these terms, you probably realize that they're not synonyms. And a bit of the danger or the challenge that we see in using those terms interchangeably is that imagine in an amazingly huge endeavor like Brillant, right? With all the different people that are involved, the researchers, the patients, the families. The danger is that if we're using different terms in different instances, in different situations, something's really going to be lost in translation. And it's a pun I'm using very intentionally here. It affects collaborations, and it could jeopardize our ability to make advances, because when we talk about diffusing information, it's not the same thing as engaging in a process of knowledge translation. So I only have this here to sort of allude us, or sensitize us to the importance of speaking the same language. But I think everybody in this room would agree that our goal is knowledge utilization. We want the knowledge to be used. But knowledge means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Okay, so I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to describe to you what we mean by knowledge utilization. Essentially, the goal is if we all use knowledge and we use it in the best possible ways, the conclusion is we will be informing, or the assumption is we'll inform and improve our practice and hopefully our patient outcomes. But as clinicians, as people in different positions, and as patients would tell you, there's different forms or different types of knowledge. And the word knowledge means different things to different people. So it's important that we recognize that research use is one type of knowledge use. Okay, so Sarah alluded to the knowledge and the experience that patients bring. It is being increasingly recognized as a very important source, a very valid source of knowledge. It makes some people cringe that it could be equivalent to evidence, but that's a philosophical conversation I'm happy to have on a different day. But essentially, research use is a special kind of knowledge use, and it's been divided in three types. So we have instrumental use, conceptual use, and symbolic use. Now, yes, this is very theoretical, but it does have quite an important significance in terms of the work that we do. Because when you talk about instrumental use, you talk about, as a clinician, taking a guideline, taking a summary, taking a synthesis like what we're doing with Brillant, and then using it, right, somehow to help you make a clinical decision. A conceptual use is when you say, yeah, this is good. I know about this. I know it's important for me to do. I know this about mobility. I know about the interventions in mobility, but it doesn't really change your behavior. That's conceptual. Symbolic is when you use the knowledge, you use the research somehow persuasively or as a political tool. So think about being able to use the syntheses, use the knowledge that we generate, even within our example of Brillant, and saying we're going to go to the government, we're going to go to policy, and we're going to persuade the policymakers, and we're going to persuade the government to make changes to access for mobility, etc. That is the symbolic utilization of the knowledge that we generate. So different people situate themselves in different categories here. Now, this is another thing that gets me very excited, but then again, my husband tells me I get excited with theoretical stuff, but I thought that I'd share this with you because we've been talking a lot about knowledge creation, and we often ask ourselves, who do we produce knowledge for? So there's a lot of text here, but essentially there's poles. On the left side, the pole is when people like Sarah and I produce knowledge, but we produce it for ourselves. Some would say facetiously, it's the ivory tower. So we're speaking to ourselves, correct? On the other end of the spectrum is the PU, which is the production for users. Now, Sarah and I and many of our colleagues are increasingly finding ourselves on this other pole. Not that the production of knowledge for knowledge's sake is not important. Any scientist would tell you it's important. But in the context of changing practices, in the context of this project with Brillant, we're very much at this pole. So we're working with and towards our users, which are all the stakeholders that are there that Sarah mentioned earlier as well. So we've been thinking about this for a while. This is 5 years ago. It was a synthesis that Sarah and I did with some of our colleagues on this idea of co-construction. So what does it mean in knowledge translation? Very theoretical paper, but essentially there's theories that talk about how you co-construct knowledge. And one day it sort of dawned on us that we should look at this particular theory, which is social constructivism, to understand, well, how do these processes of co-construction play into research and knowledge translation? And found out this morning, in fact, that it's been cited or read 900 times. So Sarah wrote back to me with a woohoo. So believe it or not, such theoretical paper got 900 reads already. So then how do we do this, right, on a day-to-day basis? And here I am with my definition. So the diffusion, the KT, and the implementation science are the vehicles through which we hopefully are going to get our community and our partners and our stakeholders to uptake some of the research that we're generating. So I'm going to describe them to you quickly, okay? I'm happy to give you these definitions also in the slides, but diffusion is when you let it happen. It's a very passive process, okay? It's a presentation, it's a conference abstract or a journal article, and you hope that you throw it out there in the ether and something will change. KT, however, is much more active. It's a targeted process, like Sarah was discussing. We know who we want to target, we know who we want to work with, and the processes we're going to put into place are going to be active, collaborative, co-constructed with a very specific goal in mind. So that is about making it happen. And then there's a group of us who apparently have nothing else to do with our time, who actually look at the science of all of that. So implementation science, André Bussière is somebody who does this, I do some of this, Sarah does some of this, is all about what are the theories, what are the models, what are the frameworks that we can use to advance the practice of knowledge translation. And I'll give you a couple examples. two types of KT, and I think that even with the Brillant, we're going to be doing both of this. So this idea that at the end of the project, we produce reports, we give these reports to our stakeholders, right? The funding agencies, they want to know, what did you do with this money? And then we create tools. Integrated KT, which is very much what Brillant is about, and I'm going to give you some of the theoretical pieces related to integrated KT, is about us working together and co-producing at all levels of the research process, but I have 5 slides at the end just about IKT. So, anybody who's interested in knowledge translation asks a bunch of questions. This is not the science now. We're still in the how-to, right? You ask, what is the evidence I'm trying to move into practice? So we talked about what mobility evidence do we want to move into practice. Who's the intended audience? Is it families? Is it patients? Is it the community? Who is likely to be our champion on the ground to help us move this evidence into practice? And once it's there, right, what resources do we need to ensure it's going to be sustainable, and how are we going to evaluate this, which is, again, what implementation science is very interested in. But this is the major questions that we ask when we're interested in knowledge translation. But if you've ever tried to start going to the gym in January 1st, or if you know anybody who has wanted to stop smoking, and even today in 2019, despite all the evidence that we have about hand washing, we still have a major problem in many institutions and many contexts. So we know that changing behavior is complex, and that's what the IS is all about, the implementation science, is those of us who think, okay, we need to identify what are the determinants of the research evidence, what's going to stand in the way of the evidence being used, right? And so what are the best methods? What are the best theories that we want to use? Do we want to look at a psychological theory, a sociological theory, an organizational theory to better understand, right? Because it's not just about a clinician not doing what they ought to be done. Gone are those days. So then we talk about KT as a 3-step process. So this is probably one of my most important messages today, is how do we do this? Well, the first thing that we need to do is to identify the gap. Okay, so what is the nature, at what level is the gap in terms of use of mobility interventions with clinicians, and how widespread is the problem? To give you some examples from rehab, these are some things that actually are some of the evidence that we have. There's an underutilization of outcome measures and assessments. Unfortunately, there's use of interventions that have been proven to be ineffective, and we're continuing to use them. And not that experience is not a good thing. I would need another hour to talk to you all about the evidence on professional experience and expertise. There's a whole field that studies that. But this idea that even in the face of very compelling scientific evidence and patient input, that we rely a little too much on our experience because we've been doing it a certain way for a certain time. And then we need to look about what are the factors that support or hinder the best practices. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, and you can read that, but my biggest point here is that gone are the days where we used to blame, quote unquote, or the major responsibility was on individual professionals. That, there are issues related to us as professionals. We may not have the knowledge. We may not believe that we have, we may not have confidence in our ability to change a practice, but there's a lot happening at the organizational level. And I know that with Sarah, we've had conversations about maybe starting to do a little more research at this end of the spectrum to also understand how these interact, the individual versus the organization. And we know that, right, with Law 10 and other changes that have happened in our context, it's not as straightforward as a clinician doesn't want to or doesn't have time to change a particular practice. So those are just some examples of what might be causing a research practice gap. And finally, it's about what's most important is about developing the strategies in knowledge translation to reduce those gaps. And that is a whole science in and of itself. It's a complex process because it's once you have to have targeted the right problem, right? Think about you go to the doctor and they diagnose you with low blood pressure or something. The intervention has to be very specific to the problem. So if in our case with Brillant, it's a knowledge or a confidence issue, right? So Sarah talked a little bit about clinician confidence. Then we're not going to be with our interventions targeting knowledge. We're going to target clinicians' confidence in their ability to use some of those mobility interventions. It might be clinician and families' confidence in working together in partnership. So we target the knowledge translation intervention to the identified problem. So this is the knowledge to action framework that Sarah introduced. So this, as she said, it's a process. What I wanted to bring up here, in addition to what Sarah was mentioning, is that within each box, there's a bunch of things that can be done. This is just a guide that you start with the problem. Where's the mobility issue? Where's the gap, right? What seems to be the problem? But every single one of these 7 steps, first of all, it could be iterative. You can go back and forth, right? You can adapt the knowledge and then go back and make sure it really, the problem has been well identified, and then go back to the barriers. But then in each of those boxes, there are methods that you can use. And you will very likely not use the same methods to assess barriers as you will to adapt the knowledge. So that's why I was saying implementation science takes each box and explodes it out, right? So if you say to me, Aliki, how do I come into a site and assess barriers and facilitators? There's some best practices on how to do that. You may care about, at the end of the day, what are the supports and barriers. What I also care is, yes, we identified them. As someone who's interested in the methods, I'm going to tell you, for example, that you can assess them with a survey. You can assess them by observing, which is timely and costly, or you can go into charts, or you know, if you're looking at practices. So there's a whole science in each and every one of these boxes that's really important. So I'm going to end with integrated knowledge translation. I think this is really self-explanatory. We're a group of stakeholders. Essentially, our goal is to get to the state-of-the-art patient care. So there's many different terms that are used to refer to integrated approaches to knowledge translation. You might have heard these: engaged scholarship, action-oriented research, co-production of knowledge. For the purposes of what we're trying to do today, these are really synonyms. So here, to some degree, it's okay if, to this idea of lost in translation. Here, these are, to some degree, fairly synonymous. But what does it mean? IKT is collaborative research. Again, Brillant is an example. Together we identify problems. It's an ongoing relationship. It's not an easy relationship to build. There's a whole science between just building relationships with stakeholders for the purposes of engaging in a meaningful research project, and everyone gets a voice at the table to support the decision making. Now, Sarah alluded to the fact that we don't speak the same languages. Here, think about researchers, policymakers. I would put patients. I would put other stakeholder groups. We're different we're different on these 4 levels. We don't always speak the same language, and we don't go by the same reward systems, right? The currency for an academic is different than a currency for a patient. What is meaningful for somebody in policy is not the same as a researcher or a patient, right? What tax at your heart strings the most? My favorite's the one at the bottom, because we operate with different timelines. A researcher's urgency is not always the urgency of a patient, and vice versa. Patients might want something done a lot quicker because the stakes on their health and well-being are important, and a researcher might respond, well, that's going to take me 1 year to figure that out for you. So our timelines are different. And unfortunately, to some degree, our values are different amongst these groups. So the what? So think of 3 words when you think about integrated KT. It's intentional, it's deliberate, it's not laissez-faire. It's all about engagement, as Sarah was saying, engaging people, empowering people, and with a breadth of knowledge users. And one of the challenges to decide who needs to be at that table, right? It's not because there's potentially 15 knowledge users that it's all relevant always at the same time. So that too is a bit of an art and a science. Who needs to be which part of the process at which point in time? The idea here is to make good use of people's time and expertise. So IKT can be transformative. There's more and more research coming out. We have my graduate student who just finished, who submitted a paper on some of the work we're doing with Strauss at McGill, looking at integrated approaches and some of the benefits of integrated approaches. Hopefully we come to a point where we share language. There's an issue of coming at the same level playing field, which means for us, yes, I'm the first one to say, I have to come down from the ivory tower, and really be on a level where we're speaking the same language. And most importantly, it needs to be authentic. It needs to not be tokenistic. So, and this is why that whether it's in grant applications and collaborations, it can't just be for show. And we need to put in processes that demonstrate that the engagement of our partners and our stakeholders is done authentically. Okay. and so everybody's perspective. So what are the benefits? The benefits is that the research becomes strengthened. So the idea with integrated KT is that the research is better, and that ultimately the obvious one is that the patient outcomes should be far superior, particularly when patients and end users have been part of the process from the beginning, telling us the questions you're asking, nah, they're not really relevant for me. This is not what is important to me in terms of mobility, right? For me, it's about being able to get into my car. For me, it's about being able to pick up my grandchildren, right? So listening to the questions that are important. The idea with this slide is that IKT is not about the end, and it's really about the journey, yeah, and it's really about the process along the way, right? What you're building, how you're building it.
Merci beaucoup.
Yeah.
C'était passionnant, franchement. Merci beaucoup.
J'ai trouvé votre présentation extraordinaire. Puis je travaille avec vous deux, puis en tout cas, je suis vraiment je suis privilégiée. Mais je trouve que c'est vraiment ce projet-là, Brillant. En tout cas, je ne sais pas si je comprends bien, mais je trouve que les frontières entre la recherche et la clinique seront presque disparues parce que je vois comme le patient comme un vecteur de recherche qui contribue, qui est tellement actif. Donc, je ne sais pas si c'est vraiment ça la vision où le patient arrive, il a accès à ces technologies. Donc, tu sais, peut-être qu'on sera même débarrassé de tous les trucs de consentement à pu finir et tout ça, où il est vraiment partenaire de tout le processus autant clinique que de recherche. Donc,
Merci pour ça, Diana. And that's really where we hope to go is it's sort of an opt-out. Everybody's data is valuable, and if we do it right and everybody sees value in this, then patients often say, use my data. If you're going to help me do better, just take my data, right? And so, and so you brought up another important group, which is ethics, which are important stakeholders in all of this.
Moi, ce que je trouvais intéressant, on en avait un peu parlé sur la mission du chercheur,
oui.
puis vous le dites extrêmement bien, la production for producer et production for user, dans l'idée d'un processus de transfert de connaissances intégré, sachant qu'il y a exactement le même problème en éthique aussi, où on arrive toujours à l'éthique en fin de parcours en se disant qu'il faut remplir des formulaires, etc., alors que ça pourrait très bien être intégré au moment où on développe les projets et à toutes les phases. Comment vous avez réussi, parce que c'est la réadaptation, à faire à effacer ces frontières, comme vous dites, entre la recherche et l'utilisation finale. Est-ce que vous vous êtes confronté, je ne veux pas de nom, hein, est-ce que vous vous êtes confronté à des chercheurs qui vous disaient que ce n'était pas forcément leur rôle ou qu'ils n'étaient pas armés pour ça et que on pouvait pas, que le transfert de connaissances était devenu un peu une mode? Je me fais l'avocat du diable,
Oui,
parce que je trouve
c'est une très bonne question.
Et si c'était le cas, comment vous avez réussi à leur faire comprendre que ça faisait aussi partie directement de...
Virginie, quelle bonne question. Ça, on pourrait en parler toute la journée.
C'est les conflits à la française, c'est savoir s'il y a eu des...
Oui. Veux-tu que je commence?
Commence.
OK. Je peux te dire, écoute, peut-être pas dans le contexte de Brillant, puis je vais laisser Sarah répondre pour Brillant. Moi, mon expérience, c'est oui. J'ai été confrontée à quelques reprises par des chercheurs, pas nécessairement des gens en réadaptation, mais dans d'autres domaines de la santé, qui disent que, par exemple, il y a une certaine frustration que, par exemple, aux IRSC, quand il y a des conversations sur où donner les fonds, c'est maintenant tout pour le transfert des connaissances, le transfert, l'application, l'implantation. Puis les gens qui font des sciences fondamentales, donc les découvertes sur mon spectre, c'est en train de perdre de son lustre, si tu veux, parce qu'il y a tellement un impact, il y a tellement une emphase sur l'implantation et l'utilisation. Écoute, c'est très philosophique, parce que finalement, c'est une question philosophique parce que est-ce que la recherche devrait être toujours to what end? Is the end of research to change lives, to change health, or can knowledge be for knowledge use? I mean, c'est une discussion qui fait partie de la science depuis très, très longtemps. Mais oui, moi, je suis confrontée avec ça, mais c'est que dans le monde de la réadaptation, beaucoup moins. Parce que ça fait partie de nos valeurs. J'ai pas eu tant ce genre de confrontation-là dans le domaine de la réadaptation. Je sais pas si tu en as eu avec Brillant, mais...
Oui, je crois qu'il y a un changement de culture. So let's just say that in the past, I would say decade, knowledge translation has been discussed. It's better understood from research like the work that Aiki is doing and others. So it's getting better, let's say. But to say that there's no, I think it's that common language problem. It's even among our 10 researchers of Brillant, when we got the money, we were all excited. We had a party. We sat in the room. We said, okay, we're going to measure mobility. We couldn't even agree among the 10 of us what we needed to measure. And until today, we realized, we better sit down and map out what words we're using. Why a biomedical researcher who has a sensor on a wheelchair, understanding that information you're generating from the sensor has to make its way into a clinical information. And they're like, why would I send it to a clinician? Well, the clinician might use that information because then they'll know where their client went, where they didn't go, have that communication. So it's not resistance. I think everybody has the will, la volonté, they want to do their work well. Mais je pense que when Aiki shared with me knowledge production for the point of production versus for knowledge uses, that clicked with me. I said, okay, now we can structure our conversations around what are we producing for us, because as researchers we need to know it. We need to know that the portable machine gives me the same parameters as the one that's in the lab. Clinicians don't need to know that. Patients don't necessarily need to know that. They need to know that the information they're getting is valid and useful, so that we could maximize the use of everybody's time, so that we're sure that what we're collecting, we see. For the first time, I guess biomedical researchers sort of looked at us and said, oh, I'm doing knowledge transfer, okay. And so it's not a resistance, it's a role. Is it my role as a biomedical researcher to worry about whether it's going to make it into clinical practice or not?
And I'm going to be even more politically incorrect now, and I'll tell you what some of the stress, some of the pushback is from those who are very much in the production for producer pole, because it's also in the literature, is that if I am very much in the PP pole, okay, the reason why being at the other end is threatening to me is that who then dictates my research agenda? Who then dictates the questions that I ask? It's no lie. See, that is part of the issue of the production with the users. We're very comfortable. That's the world we live in. And yes, we do create knowledge for knowledge's sake. And I do theory building research as well. And Sarah's an epidemiologist. So she's a methods person. So we do that to advance methods, and we do our work to advance theory. But if I'm only producing for producers, then as a scientist, I will say, who then guides, who then drives my research agenda? That's part of the pushback behind ta question, l'aspect plus politique.
Déontologique même, enfin éthique, déontologique.
Ben oui, puis ça va à l'encontre de ce que c'est d'être un chercheur autonome. C'est que si je suis complètement drivée tout le temps, bon québécois, par les besoins, je sais ça sonne pas bien, les besoins du patient, les besoins de la société, it doesn't sound too good, does it? C'est que là, à un moment donné, c'est que c'est quelqu'un d'autre qui dirige ma programmation de recherche. Fait que c'est ça l'aspect plus...
And I've heard that reflected by researchers that I've talked to as well, that they say, you don't understand, but the journals that I publish in require this. Right. So I have to talk to of course. I have to address their needs before I can look at what you want to look at.
So exactly. That's what Aiki brought up.
It's like a one-way valve.
The rewards.
The reward systems are different.
You know. That was really
so when I was going up for tenure, and when they look at your publications, you know, you have to defend that when you have lower impact journals that are typically, unfortunately, the clinical journals. What I say is, but that's who I want to talk to. I need to talk to clinicians, right? So that's a reward system. It's good for my stakeholders, it's good for my patients, for the patients I work with, but it's not good for the other aspect of the rewards, right?
Mais si on regarde au point de vue sociétal, est-ce que vous sentez, moi je sens que la recherche fondamentale est beaucoup plus valorisée. Parce que juste quand on regarde les prix Nobel, on n'a jamais vu un prix Nobel avec quelque chose de vraiment concret. Ils nous annoncent les prix Nobel, on ne comprend même pas qu'est-ce qu'ils ont fait, ces gens-là, sur une carrière de 30 ans, et c'est complètement du fondamental. Il n'y a presque rien qui se rend jusqu'à la personne. Je parle en médecine ou des choses comme ça. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous étudiez que les chercheurs se disent que tout est pour le transfert des connaissances, mais je ne sais pas. Il y a tant de
moi, je ne sais pas, je regarde Je regarde les catégories aux IRSC, puis il n'y a pas juste le TC, là, il y a plein de fondamentales. Je ne sais pas là, si on est un peu dans an era where the pendulum is starting to swing. I don't know.
C'est-à-dire qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui pensent faire du transfert de connaissances, mais qui n'en font pas, en fait, ou qui en font entre eux. Et puis, effectivement, ils ont des budgets de TC, mais qui ne sont pas forcément, au final, utilisés pour du transfert de connaissances.
But this is where the language and defining the terms and what are we talking about is really important, because for a basic scientist, their knowledge translation for them is I found a molecule that made its way into a drug. Whether that drug gets to the right patient, whether it actually makes them better in the long term, improves their quality of life later on, not just their disease, ça c'est pas des choses qu'ils veulent nécessairement étudier ou regarder. So this is where, and I guess this is where I like the knowledge producer, knowledge user terminology, because then we could talk openly about, are you doing this for KT and getting it in clinical care, or are you doing this because you need this knowledge to move to your next research question? So.
Moi, je viens d'un autre monde. C'est pour ça qu'on se connaît pas. Mais par contre, j'ai vécu ce principe-là. Je voudrais tout de suite te dire un des points que si on veut se faire écouter, nous aussi, nous devons écouter l'autre. Donc, en commençant une discussion en disant « eux sont comme ça, le fondamental est comme ça, la clinique est comme ça, le politique est comme ça », mine de rien, nous-mêmes, on fait partie du problème parce que nous-mêmes, on ne va pas voir l'autre en disant « qu'est-ce que tu fais? Explique-moi. » Et cette part temporelle-là de s'installer, c'est fou à quel point qu'on a l'impression qu'au début, c'est une perte de temps. Mais je vous le jure, pour un projet qu'on a travaillé pendant 2 ans, c'est quelque chose qui, à long terme, va être extraordinaire. Moi, mon exemple que je donne tout le temps, c'est les petits mots, c'est les pires. L'exemple que je donne, c'est un environnement. Moi, je travaille plus en santé. Donc, un environnement pour une infirmière, un environnement pour un psychoéducateur, un environnement pour un urbaniste et un environnement pour un politique. C'est pas la même chose. Alors donc, dans une première réunion, deuxième réunion, tout le monde est d'accord. Et au bout de 5 réunions, tu vois la chicane sortir.
C'est exactement l'expérience qu'on a eue.
I mean, it's awful.
With the measure, how to measure.
Yeah, and it shows. C'est tout d'un coup, tu vois, puis là, chacun s'en va sur son terrain. Et là, c'est au-delà de l'ego, c'est la formation foncièrement de comment on est. Au lieu de dire, OK, time out. Lorsque nous allons parler d'environnement, nous allons parler de ceci. Et d'être transparent. Et si jamais ça tourne un petit peu, on revient à la charte. Excusez, je veux juste rappeler que lorsque nous, on parle d'environnement, dans ce contexte-là, c'est celui-là dont on parle. Et ça a l'air ridicule au début, là, mais je vous jure, ça m'enlève beaucoup de problèmes.
Pour juste partager peut-être une expérience, pour avoir travaillé sur des sujets très, très polarisés et très médiatisés et très politiques, je parle de travail du sexe, prostitution, on peut quand même arriver à travailler ensemble dans des perspectives différentes si justement on a cette transparence-là. Moi, quand j'interviens dans ce contexte-là, avec cette approche-là, cette définition-là. On a un but commun, le bien-être du patient, de la personne. Comment on peut travailler vers ce but-là? C'est un peu c'est ça exactement comme vous dites. Ouais, exactement.
Ce que je voulais dire, c'était déjà au départ, nous-mêmes se prendre à soi, dire quel est mes préjugés,
exactement.
Et dire qu'effectivement, peut-être que je ne vais pas assez voir les travailleurs fondamentaux ou inversement un autre champ et dire explique-moi toi qu'est-ce qui est important. Parce que moi j'ai beaucoup aimé le système reward qui est tellement pas le même qu'on ne s'en aperçoit pas puis des fois on oublie.
Donc, ce que j'entends, c'est cette position d'ouverture, être transparent et maintenir une position d'ouverture pour assurer la communication. Les sites externes, est-ce que vous avez des questions? Parce que je ne vous vois pas, vous êtes tout petit présentement dans mon écran, mais si vous avez des questions, allez-y.
Bonjour, belle présentation. Moi, je suis Marie-Claude à Sherbrooke présentement. Moi, je suis dans un domaine un peu différent. Je suis en santé communautaire. c'est quand même très intéressant au niveau des transmissions des connaissances. Vous l'avez abordé vraiment très très rapidement, là, juste un petit point, mais j'aurais aimé savoir votre avis sur l'utilisation des médias sociaux, parce qu'on sait que ça entraîne beaucoup de problématiques éthiques, que c'est pas très bien défini encore, les barrières. Donc, je me demandais, vous, dans quel contexte vous les utilisiez dans un processus de transfert des connaissances et quelles barrières ou justement sous quelle mesures éthiques vous utilisiez aussi pour diriger, dans le fond, vos décisions par rapport aux médias sociaux?
C'est une très bonne question. Moi, j'utilise que Twitter. J'ai une page Facebook pour mon laboratoire, plus pour le recrutement de projets. J'en ai pas une personnelle. Mon compte Twitter, c'est un compte professionnel aussi. Et puis, je l'utilise que pour la diffusion. C'est-à-dire, j'ai un nouvel article, j'ai un étudiant qui vient de publier un nouvel article, je veux dire que notre projet avance bien ou quoi que ce soit. Donc, c'est plus un processus pour moi de diffusion. Fait que je ne l'ai jamais, comme je vous ai donné les catégories, je ne l'ai jamais utilisé ou je me suis pas penchée sur la question comment est-ce que je pourrais, par exemple, utiliser Twitter pour plus un processus actif. Je ne raffole pas des médias sociaux dans le sens que it's a slippery slope. C'est ce qui m'inquiète. Je suis pas toujours certaine ce que je peux dire, ce que je peux pas dire. Vous allez voir, mon compte Twitter, c'est tout professionnel. Et puis, je suis quand même Aiki Thomas. Je suis membre de l'Ordre des ergothérapeutes du Québec. Donc, je représente mon ordre. Je représente mon université, mes professions, mes étudiants. Donc, il faut faire très attention. Je fais très, très attention à ce que je dis, comment je le dis. Puis, il y a des questions éthiques, comme par exemple, j'ai pas le droit d'utiliser Twitter dans mon projet en ce moment pour le recrutement. Mais il y en a d'autres qui l'ont. Mais c'est un slippery slope. Puis parce que j'ai peur de ce slippery slope-là, je l'utilise un petit peu moins. Il faudrait que je me penche plus. Il faudrait que j'aie des cours là, de professionnels pour me dire comment l'utiliser plus. Mais ça m'inquiète. Je ne vous dis pas ça négativement. Il y en a qui l'utilisent beaucoup plus. Mais pour le transfert de connaissances, pour moi, c'est que dans le cadre de la diffusion.
Alors, je vais dire que pour moi aussi, c'est la même chose comme Aiki. I use it as a professional level, more to disseminate what we're doing and communicate. But I showed the slide on open science. Et quand on veut que le public soit engagé dans le projet Brillant. And so we're looking to see other models of open science that are using social media. We have lawyers with us. We have people, ethicists with us, to really structure it in a way that addresses the concerns of the public and of researchers and of clinical sites, that we're doing it in a way that, respects, and we're not presenting ourselves in a way that, might be perceived as untruthful, not authentic, as Aiki said. But there are huge possibilities, and we're looking at models like in Parkinson's disease, where they essentially open it up to the public. Do you want to enroll in a trial? Do you want to fill out this survey and tell us in 2 minutes, what you experienced the last time you went into a rehabilitation center? So it's used for recruitment, it's used for ongoing data collection, and you can see how it can give that fluidity and this momentum that it's hard to get when you have to stop, get consent, get ethics, and in a way it's what do you call it? An opt-in consent. It's if the person's willing to speak to you, they're consenting, right? But it's this having this agreement with ethics, and can you use that data in research or not, and so it's going to play a huge role. And I think for some of the questions we have that require so much data and information quickly, I think we can't afford not to look at social media as a way to do this. And investigators are sort of doing this retrospectively. So they have a question on mobility, they might go query Twitter feeds to see what have people been saying about mobility.
Yeah.
Ça a déjà commencé. Alors, our colleagues in artificial intelligence, this is always what they recommend. You don't have 2,000 people? No problem. Let's go to Twitter and see what the past 2,000 people said about mobility.
There's good potential if it's used appropriately.
If it's used appropriately with a priori thinking about why you're using it, and and responsibility in the way you diffuse that information or use
But
it.
I have to tell you, I've become way popular since I use Twitter. Like, I get people who write to me and who say, "Oh, I read your paper." Now everybody reads my paper in 48 hours.
Yeah.
Before they read it after 3 years. So that's the good thing. So now we disseminate each other's work, and now people are seeing it. They download the paper. So for diffusion and then dissemination, it's
That's
yeah.
great.
If I just add to that from the other perspective of a clinician
Mhm.
looking to absorb information,
Yeah.
I actually use Twitter for that, and I'm just going to sleep at night and I just go through my list and oh look, there's a new article that came out on that subject that I'm interested in. I decide who I'm going to follow, and they're always reputable sources. And I see that other people are following other people, and I discover things that way. So I find that from a professional point of view, it is a really powerful.
That's great to hear.
Good. That's really good.
Dans la veille scientifique qu'on diffuse une fois par semaine là, sur notre site, il n'y a pas une semaine sans qu'il y ait 5-10 articles sur l'éducation thérapeutique, enfin autogestion via Facebook, par exemple les maladies chroniques comme diabète, et c'est de plus en plus. Alors effectivement, on n'a pas forcément avancé en termes d'éthique à côté, mais par contre, ça demande dans le processus de transfert de connaissances, c'est pas juste du recrutement, c'est aussi de vulgariser, et je suis pas sûre qu'il y ait tout le temps un professionnalisme, puisqu'il y a aucune vérification en fait, donc c'est ça, il y a tout à faire.
C'est pour ça que je vous disais le slippery slope,
Ouais,
140 caractères, il faut vraiment que tu dises
mais ça
le
n'empêche pas les gens pourtant de professionnels vraiment d'utiliser.
Oui, tout à fait.
Oui, un bon exemple.
Au sein de notre groupe, on est en train de réfléchir sur les enjeux éthiques, déontologiques, légaux de l'utilisation des technologies en recherche. Puis je suis contente que vous ayez déjà entamé cette réflexion-là, parce que j'ai l'impression qu'on n'a pas suivi. Il y a un vide éthique autour de ça. Il y a une réflexion qui se fait de plus en plus. Il y a un congrès à Montréal pour définir ça. Il y a une association de recherche sur l'Internet aussi qui définit de plus en plus les enjeux éthiques. Mais c'est-à-dire...
On suit ça étroitement parce que ça va devenir très important.
Puis, ma question, c'est une question philosophique. À qui provient, parce que, on parlait d'avoir un feedback pour le patient sur les informations qui sont collectées, que lui puisse suivre de lui-même cette information-là. À qui revient la responsabilité de bien interpréter ces informations qui lui reviennent?
Alors, c'est une bonne question. C'est une très bonne question. Je viens de revenir d'une réunion de Promise. C'est un groupe qui développe and disseminates patient-reported outcome measures. And how do you use scores that come from that to make treatment recommendations? Alors, pour maintenant, on dit que mild, moderate, severe in physical health, for example, compared to the population. But on a commencé la discussion de now, how do you link it to interventions or to a specific recommendation to a clinician? Ça revient à la responsabilité de la communauté scientifique, alors les chercheurs, mais aussi, je pense, si le Integrated KT est fait bien fait, that it would also be with input from clinicians and patients, so that it's not completely out there. But we've not talked about the ethics of it. We've talked about harm. So number one, avoid harm. Right. Is it ethical to give specific recommendations on assumptions that were made based on a group of people who work together and statistical algorithms? C'est pourquoi toute cette discussion sur l'intelligence artificielle is huge, because you're essentially saying who oversees how results or output from artificial intelligence guides decision making. Is it going to avoid certain groups from getting certain access to services? You've probably all heard the example given that if you Google Translate certain translations from one language to English, if you put in there doctor, it automatically translates it to the masculine. So who creates these artificial intelligence? They're cultural, socio-demographic. It's going to influence the output you get. So you need diversity, you need representation, individuals with disability, with the condition that you're talking about. So all of these things, so who makes the decision? It's not well overseen. Is there a lot of accountability? Probably not in the context of Canada. In other countries, just because of the nature of how they function, like the US, there's huge FDA regulations around what can make its way into an electronic medical record and what can't. But we're eventually going to have structures in place to oversee that. And so for now, it's to the the researchers who create them and the networks that they bring in.
So it's groundbreaking for Canada doing that.
I think so. I think it is. Yeah. The other thing is how prescriptive should those recommendations be? You can give guidelines to some extent, but you can't tell somebody absolutely this is what you need to do, right? Even in drugs, where it's pretty, they measure it to the molecule level. They can only recommend. They can't say, absolutely this is the perfect match for you, right? So that's the wording, the how you package it. It's going to be really important. So, and we've had to work on this for the asthma portal, for the COPD patient portal, where we've had many health psychologists, clinicians, other patients review what the recommendation says to say, could this be interpreted in any other way that could be harmful? And what would go through your mind if you read this recommendation? Is there other information we should give because it might create anxiety for the patient? Or it might be promising something that really, we're not able to deliver. Or this is very important, and I think it has to be done responsibly.
Et quand est-ce que donc là tout ça est en cours et votre portail patient, c'est les délais les premiers tests ou les premiers c'est quoi vos délais de
Alors, on commence maintenant d'identifier the key players who would develop with us from an industry perspective.
Okay.
Mais l'idée, c'est de le faire dans une façon agile, right? And if those of you who know software know that means that you don't go develop something and bring it back au patient et clinicien dire, voilà le système, I hope you like it. C'est de dire...
Here you go, fait
accompli. C'est de faire une partie, une décision autour de le sensor. We're using this sensor. This is the type of data it'll give. Is that useful? This is how it will be presented. And then to add on another layer and another layer. And bring in clinicians and patients. So ideally, the system would be up and running within a year and a half from now, a year and a half to 2 years. Yeah. And add a standard deviation for reality.
One only.
And a technological, by the time we're done, they're going to tell us, like we have a system that's on Java, something called Java. They've already told us, you're using Java? Like, aren't you in .NET? Yeah.
Mais revenir à la question éthique, qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec tous ces... Moi, ce qui me préoccupe beaucoup, c'est pas l'utilisation des données par les cliniciens, parce qu'à quelque part, je me dis comme patient, tu fais confiance à ton équipe, je fais confiance au système. Moi, ce que j'aurais peur comme personne, c'est l'utilisation indirecte.
Votre réunion est terminée.
Oh my God! Donc, de dire que, par exemple, justement, à l'UQAM, je pense que la conférence avait abordé cet aspect-là, toutes tes données, ta Fitbit, toutes tes choses t'arrivent comme patient, puis tu es mesuré de bord en bord, et les compagnies d'assurance
ont tout accès à ça.
Ou les P-Rose, tu dis, tu as une dépression, tu as ci, tu as ça, tu veux pas vraiment que ça sache parce que, je sais pas moi, c'est ça, stigmatisation
ou autre,
même,
tout à fait.
Puis après ça, je me dis, comment on protège ces données? Est-ce que ça va être dans un contexte vraiment de recherche ou, tu comprends-tu, ou après ça devient dans ton dossier médical ou comme la compagnie d'assurance peut aller voir puis dire, ah, il a fait ses PIRO, ah ouais, il est déprimé, on lui a fait tous ces tests-là.
On en sort toujours au même.
Les enjeux éthiques, c'est...
Ça fait vraiment, moi je trouve que ça fait peur parce que toutes les données maintenant, tout le monde sait notre vie, on sait à chaque moment où est-ce qu'on est, qu'est-ce qu'on fait.
Yeah, I used to turn off Google Maps. Maintenant, je le laisse parce que je veux que ça me dise où j'étais, si je perds mes lunettes ou à quelle heure j'ai perdu mes lunettes, où j'étais. So, but it's a good. But when I first found out Google Maps knows where I am when I am, where what I'm doing, I was like, oh my God, But now I'm like, you know what? I like that I know where my kids are.
Your kids. Oh yeah, back to that. You're tracking the kids. Yeah.
They know I'm tracking them. Right? They like to know where I am. Also,
c'est filmé, hein, donc.
Il filme encore.
Full disclosure. So what I'm saying is, data protection is always going to be a concern. je pense, and there's no magic answer to it, but there are advances scientifically of how do you protect data and allow access. Doesn't mean it's not broken. We've seen many examples where people's data and there are breaches, but I think it's ahead of us. It's happening, and now it's to take a step back and say, okay, if we, and this is why Brilliant is an opportunity to target this head on in our case, around mobility and rehabilitation, and because we can say, this is the data that's being tracked anyway. This is the new data that we're going to add. We have this centralized database. What mechanisms will we put in place to protect that data? The centers have the same questions. They now we're telling them, you know, data's going to come in and data's going to go out to patients. Well, they want to know that that data is secure. The ministry has tables and committees to think about this and talk about it, and it's happening already with EMRs, right? Because EMRs are in place, they have to meet certain criteria, minimal requirements for security and safety. So it's a valid concern. It has to be addressed. There has to be a clear statement of this is what measures we're putting in place. Is it 110% foolproof? Maybe not. These are the things that can go wrong. But it has to be put in place, especially for obvious things like no, it shouldn't go to an insurance company, you know, to use it, and there has to be rules and regulations, maybe legislation in place of what an insurance company can or can't use in
Mais je trouve
claimants.
qu'en recherche, comme une vision les plus protégée, parce que tu lis le formulaire de consentement, tu dis vos données sont gardées pendant 5 ans et détruites après. Fait que tu dis, OK, c'est correct. Pendant 5 ans, certaines personnes ont fait. Mais de ramasser ça comme partout.
Mais ça doit être les mêmes critères. There's a way to do it much more readily, much more feasible, but you still have the same requirements. Who's going to see it when, for what purpose, how long is the data kept? Tout ça, ça doit continuer. C'est juste une question, est-ce qu'on peut le faire dans une façon plus fluide, qui ne prend pas 6 mois à avoir une réponse d'éthique?
C'est tellement riche.
Bien, merci beaucoup, Aiki.
Mon téléphone est en train de me dire que ça va me prendre 32 minutes de me rendre à McGill. Puis j'ai dit, comment c'est que mon téléphone sait qu'il va se rendre à 32 McGill? Parce qu'il a accès à mon calendrier. C'est fou.